Hi everybody, it is April and I am in my craft room, and today I'm going to show you finished quilts. The first quilt that I finished is behind me. This quilt, and I will link to the tutorial, is 10.5-inch squares that I put together for a friend of mine's mother. You did not get to see the quilting, so let me zoom in on that. What this pattern is supposed to be is a feather meander, but I kind of play around with it, and my feathers can sometimes be, you know, a little, let's call them whimsical. That's what Tucker calls them. But I did this same meander over all of this quilt. When I started the meander, I started really small and then I decided that I was never going to finish this quilt if I continued with my feathers being this small. So as I moved up the quilt, I made my feathers bigger. But I'm very happy with the way this turned out. To bind it, I used a pink grunge. I love the grunge fabrics just because it's a pink, but it's also got some other colors in it, so it gives it a lot of texture. And then here is the back. This is a 108-inch backing. I didn't have to do any sewing in order to get my backing together. Love this quilt. Let's move on to the next quilt. The next quilt you had seen quilted, but I hadn't added my binding. This quilt, I used the figure 8 for an all-over quilting effect. Let me hang this one up. What you haven't seen is the adorable striped binding. And I've had several questions on whether or not I was able to get the stain out of the cream-colored squares. I used the Dawn spray. I should have used Dawn spray on some and spray and wash on the others, but you know, I thought about that afterwards. And although it's not totally gone, if you didn't know that it was there, I don't think you would see it. To me, this quilt looks a little vintage anyway, so if there's a little bit of the stain left, I don't really think it's going to hurt the charm of this quilt. But right here, I can still see a teeny tiny bit. I'll zoom in. So right there, there's a little bit, and in a square just above, I can see the faintest bit of off-white. It isn't the dark orangey brown that it was before. And since we're all zoomed in, you can see how good this binding looks. This binding is not from the same collection as the fabric that I used that has the print on it, but I think it looks great. Pardon the interruption, but I have a secret that I want to share with you on binding. Come in a little closer. Come in a little bit closer. Oh no, that's too close. Back out just a little. The secret to binding is called monofilament thread. This is a monopoly thread, and it is essentially invisible. It's like fishing line. Put this in your bobbin when you're doing binding and leave it in your bobbin. When you're attaching your binding to the back side, you won't see the stitching on the front. Now, more than likely, that stitching is going to get overlaid when you bring your binding to the front. However, when you bring your binding to the front, on your backing, you won't see where you stitched on the front. And I don't know about you, but sometimes my stitch line is not exactly where I want it to be on the back, even though I'm okay with it on the front. This is like an invisibility cloak for Harry Potter. You won't see it. It's awesome. Let me show you. Before I show you how to use the poly mono thread, though, let me go through how I make my binding. I start with 2.5-inch strips, and then I connect them on the bias. I start with 2.5-inch strips. You put them right sides together like this, and you sew them on a diagonal so that when you pull your strip back, it lines up like that, and that is on the diagonal. Now you can just sew from side or from corner to corner, or you can mark, draw a line from corner to corner so that it's straight if you need that guide. I like to just put my needle in the center and then follow the line. And then you have a binding strip. What you do for your excess that's on the back is I just take a pair of scissors. You can use a rotary cutter, and I just cut approximately 1/4 inch off. And if I have anything on the side, I will trim it. And there I have the perfect piece of binding. I do this for as many strips as I need. Now we need to take this to the iron. So here we're going to press open the seam, and then we are going to iron the seam. Now we're going to fold our strip, our 2.5-inch strip, in half and press it. Now we're going to roll this up in a ball because I think it just makes it easier to deal with. Rolling, rolling, rolling. On some type of ruler, find a 60-degree angle. I like to use my cutting mat. Unroll your binding, open it up. Now, if you need a ruler, take a ruler. I put the corner here, and then follow the line on my cutting mat. And our goal is to have an open area where there's no binding or fabric folding over on the top part of your binding strip. Then we want to take this and press it. And this is going to make it easier for us at the end of our binding to put it together. So we're going to press this. I'm just going to finger press it for right now. We fold it over. And where this excess is, you can take a pair of scissors and trim it to where it is straight along the straight edge. Now let's take this to the sewing machine. So this is the thread that is in my bobbin. You can see it. The camera can't even focus on it. Hopefully your machine will not have an issue with it. Now I am going to be using approximately 1/4 of an inch stitch. So I'm going to put my quilt down. Now here's when all the bulk comes in. So it's a little bit more tedious to work. Again, make sure that you're doing a 1/4 inch seam. It is up to you how you want to attach your binding. You may want to glue it. You may want to clip it if you want to attach it to your quilt. I am going to take a lock stitch and I'm going to stitch to about where my pin is. I'm going to take the pin out. I'm going to back stitch. And now I'm going to fold my fabric over, and this is how I will stitch the rest of this binding to the back of my quilt. Now, if we look, right here is where the poly mono thread is. Now, I know you see the white, and that's just where the stitching has been tacked down when it was being quilted. But right here is the poly mono thread, and it's practically invisible, just like the invisibility cloak. I will start sewing my binding down, and when I come to a corner, I will show you how we do that. Now we'll start back past the opening here, and that's because we are going to tuck the end of the binding in. So we want to leave a little bit of this open so that it's easier to tuck in. So essentially this is preparing for the end of our stitching. Now here's an important note. We zoom in. We are going to stop. So here's the end of the quilt. We need to stop 1/4 inch before the end. And I don't have that marking on my foot. So I'm going to kind of go by a guesstimate, but I'll show you how you can check your guess. All right, so I'm going to guess that mine is right there. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back tack. And then I'm going to break thread. Or if you prefer, you can put your quilt on an angle and sew off to the side. What we're doing here is we are preparing for flipping our quilt to the other side. And in case you haven't really gotten the concept of what it is I'm doing, I will take this binding and I will bring it around to the front. And that is the whole goal of this exercise. So first we attach it to the back. So I'm going to snip this thread. I'm going to try not to cut my fabric. So in order to make our corner, I leave this part of my quilt straight in front of me. I'm going to fold this back, and I should have a straight line with my quilt and my binding. That's how I know that I hit the 1/4 inch mark correctly. If it went further back, then I know I need to sew another couple stitches. So this folds back at a 90-degree angle. Then I'm going to fold over my binding so that it lines up straight with the next side of the quilt. And I'm going to put a clip here to hold it in place while I wrestle my quilt around to sew on this side. I like to fold my quilt so that I don't have a whole lot over on the side. and then the rest of it goes in my lap. There's always going to be some drag when you're working with a full-size quilt. And being able to deal with that just comes with practice. So this clip kept my binding in place. So now I want to hold my binding where it was, pull my thread back, 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to start at the beginning of the corner of this quilt. Now this is where it can get a little tricky because you've got a whole lot of bulk here, but there's nothing back here under your foot. And they make this tool, it's called a universal tool, and it sits under the back of your foot so that your foot has something to press against and it can move forward. So I'm going to put that there. Don't go full throttle. That is not going to help you. Just gently ease out, and then it just kind of kicked my universal tool back, and I'm on my way to getting this side of my quilt sewn. So I'm going to finish the other 3 sides of this quilt, and when I come to the end, I will show you how we use that flap that we created at the beginning to finish the binding on the back. As you can see, I am coming up on this opening where I'm going to end up tucking my binding in order to finish the loop around the quilt. So I'm going to back tack. Yeah, that wasn't all that great. Now, as you can see, I have more fabric than I have opening. So what I want to do is I want to trim this tail the opposite way of the way that this is trimmed. So here we come wider to skinnier. We're going to go wider to skinnier this way. I want to make sure that I can tuck this in and fold this over. So I'm going to lay this here. This is where I started sewing the binding folded over. So I've got a little bit of area that I can tuck this in. So I'm going to cut my binding like that. I'm going to open. I can tuck this in. I'm going to fold over. I'll line this up with the edge of the quilt. So now you can see why we folded over where we cut earlier. I'll put this little clip here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew this just like I did the rest of the binding. And here I just want to be careful, make sure everything is lined up, fold it over like I want it, nothing gets caught in the foot. And where I should end up is the same place that I started with my binding folded over. So I just went over the top of that spot. I'm going to back up. I'm going to go forward, and I'm going to cut my thread. So now this is the easy side, because anything that's over on this side should technically get covered up when I bring my binding over. Will it? You know, that is an excellent question. I will be able to tell because I'm going to be sewing with the front of the quilt being visible. What I need to do first is I need to take these corners and I need to fold them over to the front of the quilt. So here is my corner. And this is where I do use binding clips. So I take the binding from the back, I bring it over to the front. I want to take one side and lay it where I'm going to sew it and pull it all the way straight and flat. While holding this in place, I am going to fold this side over and make it flat. And this is a perfect corner. So I'm going to clip it. See where the edge of this binding meets the edge of that binding. That is what I want my corners to look like. And that is what you will do to all 4 corners. And although you've already seen the backing, I'm going to show it to you one more time. Here is the backing. And that stripe looks just as good with my backing as it does with the front of the quilt. There's one more quilt to look at. I did the binding a little differently on that quilt, so let me show you what I did. I just want to take a few minutes to say some thank yous to people who have emailed me and commented on my videos. Rebecca Deason, thank you for your email. I love Pioneer Woman fabric. And when I am quilting that Pioneer Woman quilt, I will definitely be thinking of you. Christina Hall, I too absolutely love Yorkies. Please tell Ben hi. And 3-yard quilts are my jam. Richard, I appreciate you keeping me caffeinated. So here you can see my finished quilt. Hi, me again. Since I have already interrupted this video to show you how I did the traditional binding with the monofilament thread, I thought, well, I'll just interrupt again and show you how I did the binding with the backing folding over. I'm going to show you how I finished the binding on the quilt that my mother-in-law is going to steal. The way that I'm going to bind this quilt is different. Why is it different? It is different because I am going to use my backing to create my binding. So here's my backing. I have cut a distance, just depending on which quilt it is, but I will choose a distance, usually about 1 inch or 1.5 inches, to cut away from the edge of the quilt to trim the backing to be all the same distance from the front of the quilt. Then I will take the backing and fold it over and clip it to the front of the quilt. So if you watch what I am doing, I like to do that when I'm getting ready to sew it. I like to do that at the sewing machine, and I do one side at a time. It just keeps it from getting so monotonous. Now, the corners are special. I use a ruler to get the corners so that they fold over. Let me show you how. So here, I want to line the edges up on a 45-degree angle, and this is to make the corner. Here, here, done. And there, I have a corner. I am going to take some chenillet. This is chenillet. And what it is what it is fabric that is cut across grain. I'm making this stuff up, but you can make it yourself. I don't know how, but I know you can make it yourself. It's kind of stretchy, And what happens is you take it off of this roll, if you don't make it yourself, you attach it to fabric with thread, and when you wash it, it frays. Let me show you. Do I have some? I do. It looks like this, which is pretty cool. Now what I'm going to do with it today is a little different. I'm going to use it on a binding that I'm folding over on the top. So it will fray. It'll just look a little different than this does, because I want to do something a little special with the edge of this quilt. So you can see I have folded it over. So what I will do is where I fold it over, I'm just going to lay the chenillet on top and clip it in place. Then when I wash it, not only will I have the binding done, but there'll be something special here. And what I'll do is I will just sew all along the chenillet as I am closing the binding using the backing from the quilt. So here you can see my finished quilt. I've got the fleece that I brought over from the back, and then when I washed it, the chenillet kind of fluffed up, and it gives it just a little extra something. And as I wash it over and over, or as my mother-in-law washes it over and over, it will chenille, it will get a little bit fluffier each time until all of the chenillet is fringy. I hope that you have enjoyed this video going over several quilts that I have finished. I know that I have had comments before saying that people would like to see the quilts that I've made and the ones that I have finished. Now, the quilt that had the 10.5-inch squares, that has gone to its new home, so I hope that Dawn's mother enjoys it. And I'm not sure what's going to happen to this quilt. We'll have to just wait and see. I may just be donating it to somewhere. And of course, we all know who's getting the quilt behind me. Remember her? She came to visit a little while back. Make sure to check the description below. I have linked to when I made these quilts. It might be something that you're interested in watching. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Eat some chocolate and be kind to everyone. Until next time, bye. And if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Bye. Polly, and when you're sewing, and 3-year my video to show you how I did the and when you wash it, whatever you and then I don't know what then. I'll be right back. Any sewing in order to get my bank. That is not what I want to say. And it gets just.